Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on History Bite podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Nina Livesey, and we're going to be discussing a bit about her upcoming book, Reassessing Apostolic Authorship. Although by the time I release this video, her book would already have came out. I'll have the link to the affiliate link in the description below to purchase Professor Nina Livesey's book. So thank you for joining me today, Professor Livesey.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for joining me.
Second time, I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and it's in person.
This is nice.
Good to see you in person, yeah.
It's great to see you too.
Yeah. So I'd like to start us off with what led you to postulate the authenticity of these 7 epistles? Really, I should also ask, really, in context of that, what led you to believe they are inauthentic? So what convinced you that they were authentic initially, and then start us on the journey of what led you to thinking the opposite?
Yeah. Well, just my training, and it's the same training that goes on today in undergraduate courses on the Bible. These 7 letters are the only letters that are authentic of Paul. I learned all of that in graduate school. That's just been the common lore for, 50 years, maybe longer. So I totally embrace that. I've written papers on that. There's a paper that is seen very often now, Women in the Authentic Letters of Paul. And I've totally embraced the 7 authentic letters of Paul. So I've transformed. And I do not think those are authentic letters. I should just say that right out. I don't think any of the Pauline letters are authentic of Paul, and I date them later, but we'll probably get to that in a minute or two. Mm-hmm. So, but what led me to it, and there was a trajectory, a kind of history, my scholarship, my experiences, it all led to a new look. And the first thing I'd like to say is this work on rhetoric, and you and I already talked a little bit about that. I have a second book out on Galatians and the rhetoric of crisis. I wrote that, and I say this because I think it also plays a role in my ability to rethink. I wrote that letter out of the country, or the book out of when I was out of the country, and I was able to sit in a place away from home and really think about, in detail, the rhetorical moves that, at that time in my book, Paul was making. So I looked at it very closely, and I compared Paul to both Cicero and Demosthenes, professional orators and rhetors, and more sophisticated, really, than what you see in the Pauline letters. But with those other 2 authors in hand, and then, as I said, kind of re-looking at Galatians just through that rhetorical lens, I could see the depth of the construction of the so-called autobiographical sections, the emotion aspect of it. Again, I'm comparing, and then I'm also getting pretty heavy into rhetorical theory because I had to back up everything I was saying. So I was still in France and looked at rhetorical theory there, and one thing in that rhetorical theory really influenced me very heavily is rhetoric was used to actually do construction of texts. It's not rhetoric that kind of stands on top of literature and just goes along for the ride and enhances what you want to say. But rhetoric can actually be part and parcel of developing what you want to say, the whole cloth of it. So rhetoric constructs the truth, you might say. That made a big impression on me, the idea of how rhetoric works. And it does play out because in the rhetorical theory, rhetorical techniques, it is construction, even polemics. You can accuse your opponent of whatever you want. It's constructing them as an other that is not morally upright. Okay, maybe the person was morally upright, but with your polemics, you're creating that situation. So you can see in rhetorical theory, they're learning about polemics. They're also learning how to speak in the voice of somebody else. So all of these are constructive techniques, and all of that played a role in my thinking. So then gradually that led me to really believe that these letters were something other. I could then go from the internal look to what about the letters themselves? Maybe these letters then are not what they purport to be, genuine letters. So I made that jump tentatively. But then, at the same time, and this is after I got back to the U.S., I was in communication with a close classicist friend and colleague, and she kind of pulled me aside at a meeting and said, it's likely that Pauline scholars or even biblical scholars are, in the way they assess those 7 letters as authentic, they're likely overconfident in that because authorship is very difficult to assess. And yet, and it's true of all the scholarship, those letters are definitely authentic. They're just taken as authentic. So once she said that, I thought, I am going to research how did that authentication process come about. So I talk about that in the book. And it's flimsy. I'll give you a heads up. So that is also confirming my suspicions about the letters. So now the letters, I'm already skeptical. They could be something other than genuine letters. So then I think I just fell into, because I don't remember anybody handing me the book, but I used Patricia Rosenmeyer's Ancient Epistolary Fiction, her 2001 book, and that was just fascinating and eye-opening to me. And her book and other scholars of that ilk, especially her book, became my constant companion as I was writing this book that's about to be published. She opened my world to fictional letters and how they can be used. And I was then, and I remain, completely fascinated by what you can do with a fictional letter. The rhetorical use of a letter, the letter itself, and that's Rosenmeyer, that book. She talks a lot about how fictional letters can be used for all kinds of things. So then I had all my pieces in place to put my thesis out there.
When do you date the Pauline epistles, before or after the composition of the Gospels?
Well, once I realized, or I was getting quite convinced that the letters were not genuine, something important happened there, because those authentic letters are in the mid-1st century. They're dated there. They're placed there.
Right.
So once I decided they're not genuine, I could let go of that mid-1st century. And it was an easy move to make, I'll tell you, because in fact, there was a line in the book, and I think I removed it. There was nothing that held me to saying these letters absolutely need to be in the mid-first century. Nothing held me there. The way that the dating of mid-first century comes about is internal, the internal references of the letter. So it's insular. And we all know that authors can write about Babylonia and be in the 20th century. So you're not going to say the composition of that piece took place in the Babylonian Empire. So we know that internal dating, it cannot be the final determiner of a text of literature, and the same is true for letters. So once I got freed up of that mid-first century, then I could look at some of the references in the letter. And of course, the Paul of the letter knows about the Passion, Jesus Christ on the cross, crucified. And then for me, the knowledge of that would have come from the Gospels. So that made me say or think, and I still do think, the letters come after the Gospels. And more importantly, Acts. Acts plays a role in my whole thesis as well. So post-Gospels, the letters come after the Gospels.
So you would therefore...
Or at least one Gospel. At least one Gospel. Maybe not all the Gospels, but at least one Gospel.
Well, either way, that's how you would explain why Paul, or the person claimed to be Paul, or persons in these letters, how they seem to know a Passion account, how they make imply to it. So rather than hypothesizing a pre-Pauline source, one of the Gospels or all of them are the source or sources for this pretender or so-called Paul. So Acts, what do you make of Acts in relation to Paul's epistles? It is often said that Acts is independent of Paul's epistles, one of the reasons being because it never mentions Paul's letters. Or is it because the letters hadn't been written yet when Acts was composed?
Well, the short answer, I think that the letters, I'm really feeling stronger and stronger daily almost on this, that the letters need to follow Acts. They're derivative of Acts. So I think what we have is there's at least one gospel. It may be Marcian's gospel. And then we have Acts. And then we have the letters. I think that's how it needs to go that way. So why... we've known for a long time, at least in some circles, that Acts and the letters seem to know each other. But of course, the scholarship, because of this authentic letter paradigm and the letters being early, it had to be that Acts, in that scholarship that shows that Acts and the letters know each other, it always had to be that Acts knew of the letters, but it never fessed up that it knew of the letters. And there's been some very good scholarship by Bill Walker, for instance, his exegesis, almost scientific, detailed work to show that there's even linguistic parallels between Acts and the letters and certain incidents that really show that Acts, and in Walker's view, Acts must have known the letters in order to talk about various things like the Jerusalem incident and things like that. So, but one of the things, once you let go of that paradigm, then you start asking yourself, well, who's Paul? How do we get Paul. If they're not real letters, and there's no first century Paul who wrote those letters, then I had to ask myself, well, how do we get Paul? And that's where I turned to Acts. And Acts is very strategic with Paul. The first part of it is Saul, and then he has this transformation. Well, he has the transformation in Acts 9, where he still remains Saul. But then in Acts 13, when you see the conversion of this fellow Sergius Paulus, Saul also is called Paul. So I feel that we get Paul from Acts, and that's how we know of Paul. There's one other thing that I think works in alongside that notion of Paul coming from Acts, is Paul in the letters is very much Apostle Paul. How do we get Apostle Paul? Or why, you might ask, why would Paul call himself an apostle? And it's very intentional in Galatians, and as you know, I've worked a lot on Galatians. So why call yourself Apostle Paul if the whole idea of an apostleship is not known? And in the older paradigm, the 7 authentic letters, early, preceding Acts, preceding even Gospels, because now we're putting the Gospels a little bit later too. So the letters are supposedly the very first instances of New Testament texts. Well, why would someone call themselves an apostle if that, and I think that apostle has a theological overtones. It's not just a messenger, because there is a word apostle that just means a messenger, and it had an association with shipbuilding. But these letters aren't about shipbuilding. It's very theological in the opening. So why call yourself an apostle if there's no apostle even known? Why would I want to say I'm an apostle? Mm-hmm. You see what I mean? So that's another reason why I think you need a gospel with 12 apostles, but it's in Acts where the apostles really come alive and they carry things forward, right? So, and I think the letters are in friction, or you might say contention with Acts, because in Acts is careful to not really dub Paul an apostle. There's one verse in there that maybe suggests that he was an apostle, but I think it's a little dubious whether Paul and Barnabas are apostles. So,
well, it would seem like one way or another that I think you make an interesting point there, because regardless of Acts, like, okay, in that one little instance it does, but it doesn't accentuate the point too much. But then you get the epistles, which do. Either way is building over Acts, is your point. And I think it's very interesting, because I have wondered in the past, it's always creeped me out that Acts never mentions Paul's letters. Mm-hmm. And if Paul's letters were written before Acts, but the logic is Acts is independent of Paul's letters, then how do you know they existed before Acts? And even if they somehow did, where did Acts get its information from then? Mm-hmm. They hypothesize, as those that believe that will hypothesize different sources or an oral tradition, a convenient oral tradition. Exactly. I'm like, well, can you be sure about that tradition?
I know. I've seen that so much. It's the fallback. The other thing is epistolary scholarship again, and I go back to Rosenmeyer, because in my own mind I played around with this notion, which is first, Acts or the letters. But in epistolary scholarship, you need to have the character developed first before you have the letters attributed to the character. And that's repeated in pseudonymous letter collections, which is what I think this is. No one would bother reading letters of Paul unless Paul already existed. And that goes for fictive or factual characters. So Paul's got to be out there. Do you see what I mean? For these letters to have any agency or any effectiveness. There's one other thing that's occurred to me more recently that I've played with, which I think has some credence. It looks like even in Galatians, that autobiographical section, which I've worked on a lot, which Galatians 1, where you see Paul say, "You've no doubt heard of my persecution of Jesus groups, and I tried to kill them," or whatever. I think it's Galatians 1:13. And you just kind of read over that, and you just, with the old paradigm. But how would we have heard of that? But if you say, well, yeah, I would have heard about it if I knew Acts. So what I'm thinking is, because pseudonymous letters are really, the target of those are not the addressee, the internal addressee, they're external readers. So it looks like that statement is a nod to external readers, the buddies out there who might be hearing this letter or reading that letter. They're the creators. They're the gospel creators. They're the Acts creators. They're in this group of literary producers. So they have Paul say, "You've no doubt heard." It's like a nod to the guy in the audience who, read that in Acts. That's how I'm reading that now. Probably needs more development, but so I just think Acts has the priority.
Do you believe the Pauline epistles tell us anything reliable about the historical Paul, even if none of them are by Paul himself?
Well, I've kind of indirectly answered that.
Yeah, that's true.
And the thing about Acts, and there's been some work done on this, where Acts plays around with names. There's many characters who end up with multiple names, and it's a literary technique to show a transformation of some kind. Paul becomes missionary to the Gentiles, and so his name kind of takes on, he gets this Roman name. So there's this playing around with names. So in the scholarship, it's funny, when you read Acts, we hear about the author playing around with names, but somehow when it talks about the name Paul, that author doesn't play around with that name. There is so much wrapped around Paul, the historicity of Paul, and the letters being genuine, that even though good scholars know about Acts and how it uses names, how it creates narratives, it doesn't want to touch Paul. So I think that's a little strange too, and I think we need to see Paul as part of the character mix in Acts. It's a long way around of getting away from that exact answer of historical.
Why do you think the letters were composed?
Well, it's here that I think that if there was some genius involved in this early Christian literature, it was the composition of letters. And that's another thing that one can think about. why does the New Testament have all these letters? Where you think about the Hebrew Bible, there aren't any standalone letters. There's one in what we call intertestamental works, this letter of Jeremiah. So it's very interesting that you would have Paul take on agency with letters. And why I think it's genius is because of the power of the letter genre itself. Maybe one of the most important points here is a letter seems real. A letter, if you get a letter somehow, it has importance in and of itself. It seems personal. You can put anything into a letter. You can, make moral advice. It's infinitely flexible on what you can put into a letter. It's very interesting, the rhetorical value of letters. And so if you're going to say something, you Corinthians ought to do X, Y, or Z, you could write a treatise about it, and it would be rather dry. But if you send a letter, and an external reader, a secondary reader, is looking at that, it automatically creates interest, because that reader sees, it looks over the shoulder and it's seeing, oh, Paul, this authoritative figure, who becomes authoritative because he's a letter writer, because that's another thing that letters do. You see over the shoulder advice given to somebody else, and that's also attractive to readers. It's much more lively than reading a treatise. So that's where I think some of the genius takes place, is to adopt the letter genre. And this was already being done. So I'm not making this up. We already have it with Seneca and his moral epistles. There's 140 of these things. They're all fictitious letters to somebody that he creates, this character, Lucilius. And all of the advice that he wants to give to Lucilius is in the medium of a friendly letter. They're very attractive to read that as an external person. So the entirety of Stoic philosophy is in letters. And it keeps the conversation going. It's, as I said, lively and interesting.
Do you think the historical Paul wrote anything at all that might have been lost and could have been replaced by all these forgeries instead?
I wouldn't call the letters forgeries. I would kind of flip the script on that and say the letters become important because they're ascribed to Paul, and Paul is important. Paul is very important for the Christian tradition. I mean, we all know that. And how does he become important? Through Acts. So the fact that you have letters, even if they're fictitious, I think that they're important. They're not forgeries. I wouldn't use the word forgeries. Okay. And I don't know if there would be. It seems unlikely to me, but I don't know, and there's so much more to learn myself, and who knows what's going to be discovered. But I think from what we have, this Apostle Paul, and then he takes on a new persona with the letters. Intentionally, somebody really wanted to take in new directions.
In my closing question, do you think anything, let me rephrase, so do you think that the book of Acts is the most reliable text we have about the historical Paul, despite whatever goals it might be having to try to perhaps embellish or change details?
I don't find Acts to be historically reliable. I find Acts to be literarily reliable. Acts puts out the narrative. So it's valuable in the narrative world. But, and now I'm not saying anything new. Many scholars would contest the historical reliability of Acts. And I guess I go far with that. I think it's a constructed narrative. So I'm sorry about the historical Paul. You've asked me about the historical Paul a couple of times. And I don't know, Paul is an important person, right? So I don't know if the historical value is what's the most important thing. In fact, if you say Paul is historical, then I think you've got a problem, because then what happens to this person? Because everything else that succeeds Acts, as we think of it, as apocryphal literature, and Paul shows up in some of that literature. So what would have happened to that person? We have no history. The whole history of anything that might have been historical, nobody has any history of it. It doesn't exist. So it stops. And I don't know that there was a history there. So there's a conceptual problem with that.
So you're not sure Paul existed?
Right.
Today I am joined by Professor Nina Livesey. This is the second time I've interviewed her in person. Last time we did the interview, we were in San Diego, November 2024. And now we're here in Dallas, Texas. So it's good to see you again, Nina. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. It's nice to see you too.
Yeah.
Face-to-face is nice, more relaxing.
Yeah, it indeed is. So today's discussion is going to continue off from where we left off last time, as we continue to discuss her book, now that her book is actually out as of this recording. It's called Letters of Paul in Their Roman Literary Context, Reassessing Apostolic Authorship. And I'll have the link in the description below to purchase the book, and also in the pinned comment. So what led you to reassess the authenticity of these 7 epistles, often held to be genuinely Pauline by consensus of scholars?
Right. It is a shift. It's a biggish shift, actually. And what happened was a gradual process, and as I mentioned a little bit in the previous interview, I had worked very intensely on, especially the letter of Galatians, from a rhetorical perspective, really digging in deeply into how the author was trying to persuade, and it was a comparative study between Cicero and Demosthenes and the letter of Galatians, who I assumed at the time was Paul. So I was dealing with who I thought was Paul. So that all that study puts you very much in the mind of the author, you might say, behind the text. So that was, I was already there trying to see what is this author doing. And I think that really led me on this path that I'm currently on, putting myself in the shoes of the author. So that was the first move that I made, you might say. And once you are in that, the shoes of the author, one of the questions that you tend to ask is, how did this author learn all of this stuff? Right. What kind of an author is this? And of course, I'm comparing Paul, at the time I thought it was Paul, to orators, very well-known orators who certainly knew what they were doing, Demosthenes and Cicero. So I'm already, you might say, elevating the author of Galatians into a well-educated person. That already became very clear to me by 2016 when that previous book came out that we talked about before, actually, in our first interview. But then after, and this is gradually, it didn't come to me all at one time that it wasn't Paul. I had no reason not to think of Paul, because when you think of all the scholarship, no scholarship really is saying it's not Paul. Those letters are fixed, you might say, as authentic.
Right.
But gradually I started to question whether or not you could say Paul was the author. And I think it was because of so much strategy that I saw. I thought, is it really Paul the author? Is Paul actually the author? But it was gradual. And I started this current book, The Letters of Paul in Their Roman Literary Context, in 2018. So by then, I already wanted to explore. And so it started out as an explore, really, on authenticity, because I was asked, well, how do scholars, how can scholars be so sure that these letters are authentic? And that then put more questions in my mind. And I thought, well, I ought to research this. I didn't know this. So that's how this whole book started. And the authenticity process, the way these 7 letters are assessed as being authentic, is very weak. The criterion were weak, the arguments were weak, and so very soon I was able to see that this authentic perspective was crumbling. So then I kept moving on more and more to see what more could be discovered. And what are these letters then?
Do you believe the Pauline epistles tell us anything reliable about the historical Paul, even if none of them are by Paul himself?
I think the short answer is no, and I'm going to get to a little bit more of that later on, I think, with you. But one of the first questions I asked myself on this so-called authentic perspective that focuses so much on the historicity question, which is what you've just asked me, the historicity of the letters and the historicity of Paul. One of the early questions I asked myself was, were these letters always thought of as historical and the historical Paul? To be honest, it's hard to answer that directly, but you can indirectly get the answer to that question by seeing, and I struggled with this in the book, and where I end up is on the question of interest. What were people who looked at these letters interested in? Right now we're interested in history, we're interested in the Corinthians, let's say, and that leads us to this scholarship on the history of Corinth. So that historical question is very much now, but were those kinds of historical questions there originally, or maybe closer to when those letters would have been written? Maybe not exactly, the next day or the next year, but within 50 years or even less of when those letters were written. What was the interest in these letters? And that was eye-opening for me too, because you don't see so much, you don't see anything about the town of Corinth or Thessalonica, what Paul is up to. You don't see those kinds of things emerging in the writers who are looking at those letters, and I'm talking Irenaeus, Tertullian, Ptolemy even, what they're looking at is they're all mining the letters in a way. Right now we're mining them for history, but they were mining them too, and they're mining them for theological questions. So that historical question was off the radar, out of the radar, I think, and it was theology that was of interest. Now, let me add something else here.
Sure.
So the fact that the theology is of interest, I think, is important because it shows, or it showed me, that once those letters are out there, once there's a letter of Paul, they became important. I use the word authoritative, I use the word scripture-like, but somehow those letters of Paul became important, not for history, as I said, but more for theology, that theological perspectives. Paul says this. No, Paul says that. Paul says there's one God. No, Paul says there's two gods. You know, these kinds of questions. And they need those letters. And from an early point, they need the letters. I think that's interesting, too.
Is 2 Corinthians 11:32-33 a reliable chronological anchor for Paul?
So that's a good question, and it really segues from your previous question. And I do look at that passage because it becomes, as you say, in the scholarship, well, there must have been Paul, there must have been a historical Paul because of a passage like this, 2 Corinthians. So let's see what that says. 2 Corinthians 11:32-33. So that reads, in Damascus, the governor, under King Aritus, guarded the city of Damascus in order to seize me, meaning Paul. But I, Paul, was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped from his hands. That means the governor. He escaped. Paul is talking in the first person, or Paul, in the letter writer Paul is talking in the first person. So this King Aritus has been the historical marker to somehow prove Paul was there in the mid-1st century during this time of King Aritus, and I think it's this King Aritus IV, who was supposedly in charge of Nabatea, the region of Nabatea. Well, there isn't any, when you start to research King Aritus IV, you find out that the historicity of this fellow, King Aritus, is a little bit in doubt. There isn't anything on record, you might say, in the historical record, of him being in charge of that region at that time, or at any time, I don't think. So already there's some question about King Aritus and being in charge of a region around Damascus. That's already being questioned. But then the larger issue, and the larger issue here is, even if Aritus is there, and even if he is in charge and he has a governor, and all of that were absolutely true to the historical record, the only place that you see Paul, I would say character Paul, with the governor of King Aritus is there. There's no corroborating evidence for this. And it is frequent. It's a trend in writing, historical writing, literary writing, to drop names. So even though you have a historical person, and we do have historical people in the scriptural literature, you've got King Herod, you've got other people, you've got real places, it doesn't necessarily mean you can count on the historicity of the event at that time. It can just be a name dropper. And it does seem like that's the way it's working here. And the other thing that is a little bit of a giveaway of non-historical is this trope of Paul being let down a basket. That recurs in other scriptural passages. If you think of Rahab and the spies of Joshua, those spies are let down through a basket. Michal, who's one of the wives of David, she lets David, he's not quite king yet, it's in 1 Samuel, she lets David down fleeing from danger. So it really looks literary and not necessarily historical. I guess that's my answer on that one.
What is interesting is that Josephus does say that King Aritus III controlled Damascus. The problem is that Aritus lived a century prior to when Paul was supposedly active, which is curious. That's always bothered me. Because I wonder, did they mix up one Aritus with another? And if Paul did that, how does that work?
Right.
That's strange. In scholarship, they try to speculate about what does this mean, King Aritus controlling Damascus. Let's see.
It could have been a mix-up, It could have just been King Aritus. It's Pauline scholarship that insists that it's King Aritus IV. It could have just been another reference to King Aritus that doesn't necessarily fit with when King Aritus lived or when he would have controlled Damascus. So, yeah, it's pretty loose. Those kinds of things are pretty loose.
And people can make, like even today when they do films, fictional films, and they have actors playing the role of people that actually lived, and they're meeting fictional people that never lived. This is something I want to throw in there. What do you make of Crestus, who is said to have led some sort of rebellion in Rome around 49 CE that caused the expulsion of the Jews during Emperor Claudius's reign?
That's good. That's another, indirectly, that's another so-called historical anchor for getting Paul in the mid-1st century. That shows up in another passage that I discuss, which it's within Acts 18, chapter 18. And it's related because you see this Crestus situation with regard to Aquila and Priscilla. And I have that also. So Acts 1-2, and this is getting into that Crestus question that you just asked me. And so Acts 1-2, after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Okay, so this is getting close to the Crestus question. So that becomes an anchor. This Claudius had asked all Jews to leave Rome. So of course Claudius existed. There were Jews in Rome, so there's not an issue there. So how do we get Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome? So when scholars look for that, they land on Suetonius, who wrote, we think, around the time of Hadrian, so early 2nd century. He wrote this work called The Lives of the 12 Caesars, Claudius being one of the Caesars. And in that work, the part that's attributed to Claudius, again, Suetonius is claimed to have written it, it's there that you find this reference by Suetonius that Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome because Crestus had started agitating. There was agitation by Crestus. Then we wonder, we can look at the historicity of even the event. Did Claudius ask all the Jews to leave Rome? That's not necessarily corroborated by the historian Cassius Dio, who says that Claudius simply wanted Jews to stop congregating. So the Suetonius passage cannot necessarily be corroborated, that Claudius asked the Jews to leave, and that then would disqualify, you might say, that Crestus, which is only cited there in this Suetonius passage. The other thing to mention about this Suetonius Lives of the 12 Caesars, from which we get the reference to Crestus, is that has been classified as neither history nor biography. What is that? It's some kind of literary work. We don't know exactly how to classify it. Embellished work to embellish these 12 Caesars. It doesn't look terribly reliable for history, for one thing. But then to get a little bit closer to the Crestus question, which is what has really piqued scholars, there must be Christians in Rome in the mid-1st century, which would lend more credibility to Paul the Christian in the mid-1st century, and more historicity to a lot of Christianity in the mid-1st century. The fact that this Suetonius passage looks suspicious, I think rules against that. And the other thing, when I look at it, well, I should say one scholar in particular really pushes back that saying that Crestus is a common name, it doesn't necessarily mean Christian. But let's for the moment say he was talking about, it was supposed to be Christus and he just misspelled it Crestus. And it was supposed to allude to Christians. That to me seems quite problematic for a Claudius to be writing about, because the first word Christian, so you get the notion of a Christian, is not until the 2nd century from any of our sources. So how would Claudius, in my reading of it, have any notion of Crestus, Christ, Christian in the mid-1st century? It looks like it's influenced by Acts or something within Acts. Agitation by Jews. It looks suspiciously, to me, influenced by that.
When do you date the Pauline epistles?
Well, in the book, which you have the book and you've seen it, I am saying that they're in the mid-2nd century, and I've defaulted, you might say, to 144. And the way I came about that is because of Marcian. The first evidence that we have, and this, I kept researching the book. It led me to down one path, down another path. And then, well, when do we get these letters? And that's how I ended up with the Marcian, the centrality of Marcian, because that looks like it's the first actual evidence of the letters is with Marcian, who published 10 letters, and the publication came out at 144. So you can probably, before the publication, I'm assuming the letters came into existence somehow right before. And I think they're pseudonymous, I think they're fictive, so I don't think they have anything to do with an historical first century Paul. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does.
Okay.
If you can expand on the connection between Marcian and the emergence of the 13 Pauline epistles?
Right. Well, as I said, I didn't start out with Marcian. I kind of fell into Marcian, and I get to Marcian in the very last chapter of the book. The chapter before goes into, because I was so interested in a letter, why a letter? Why would somebody pick up a letter? Why would you have Pauline theology in a letter? So that got me onto epistolary questions, which I spent a lot of time with. And finally, I needed to locate the letters. So I ended up, as I said, with Marcian as the first emergence. Marcian, though, the more I looked at Marcian and the more I came to the conclusion of authorial strategies, the need for an educated person, all of those questions that I already came to my mind in 2016 when I was doing the work on rhetoric, Marcian looked more and more attractive as a location for the development of the letters. Marcian, along with others, is attributed with a school. So a school setting fit that, my image of those letters as constructed. You need the outfitting of a school to do any kind of literary production, including letters. So Marcian looked more and more likely. Not only were the letters first, for sure, emerging with him, he is said to have a school. He's said to have the wealth. He likely had access to other materials. He clearly published. He wrote this work, which is no longer extant, these antitheses, for which he's known and much disparaged, I guess. He made contrasts between the law and the gospel. We don't know exactly what those antitheses were, although this Harnack tried to recreate the antitheses by kind of mirror reading some of the people who were writing about Marcian. So Marcian looked like the likely location for these letters. As I said, there's 10 letters with Marcian, and I do think that later on more letters were added. These pastorals were added, because you said, what about the 13 letters? Mm-hmm. 10 came with Marcian's collection, and then 3 more were added, and then Hebrews at some point was added as well.
And Ephesians replaced Laodiceans in the process.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then these prologues are also attributed to Marcian. So Marcian is writing. He is doing some writing.
While many scholars dismiss the authenticity of 2 Thessalonians, Colossians, Ephesians, 1st, 2 Timothy, and Titus, they believe 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, 1st and 2 Corinthians, Romans, Philippians, and Philemon are authentic. Mm-hmm. Do you believe that the same person wrote those 7 separate letters, or is it multiple authors writing in the name of Paul?
Well, that's a good question, and I did ask myself that question. You know, I was schooled, and a lot of us, that those 7 letters were by the same hand and by the hand of Paul, who I now refer to as the Apostle Paul. is that's how the Paul in those letters is characterized as Apostle Paul. I never actually answer that question. I subordinate the question. I don't know exactly the answer to it. I think you could say perhaps one person wrote those letters, but I also don't necessarily think Marcian himself necessarily wrote the letters. It's possible Marcian wrote some of the letters. But what I do say in the book is the school actually produced the letters. So some of the students in the school could have written those letters, the Marcionite students. And I can imagine, going back to the school setting, where Marcian is the teacher, maybe his main teachings are these antitheses, and he would ask his students, so how about writing a letter in the name of Paul that would promote this particular thesis of mine? And that could very well have been how these letters come about, where different students are asked to write a letter. And the other thing I'll say is ancient education knows full well and trains students on what's called speech and character, where students are asked to write in the name of someone. A letter is essentially that. It's a fictive letter. Write a letter in the name of, as though you were that person. And that can be easily a school exercise. So I can imagine something like that as the genesis of these letters.
What's interesting is that I believe it was Pseudo-Tertullian that says it was Curdon who produced this abridged Paul that Marcion would take over. And also the gospel as well. Just want to throw that in there real quick.
Okay.
Do you think the letters were composed before or after the Gospels and Acts have been written?
Okay. I think that at least one gospel needed to have been already there in the wind, maybe even in pre-published form before you have the letters. And I think the same about Acts. Acts really features large for my thesis. Acts as needing to be some form of Acts before the letters of Paul. In terms of the gospel being there before, I ran across this interesting passage in Tertullian, who read it that way, read Galatians, where you see euangelion, the word, which means gospel, in Galatians, where Paul is saying, these others don't have a gospel, I have the true gospel. In Pauline scholarship, that's interpreted primarily as the message, because they're not assuming there is a written gospel in the mid-first century. It's a message. Paul is promoting a message. I haven't seen super clearly what exactly that message is, and maybe it depends on which person you're talking to, exactly what Paul's gospel was. But Tertullian read it as a gospel text, which I found interesting, assuming then that by the time Galatians is written, there was this gospel, or maybe many gospels. So I found that very interesting. The other thing, there's all the concepts too. The letters, I'll mention this one thing. you've got Jesus, but with Christos in the letters, which this Christos is already a post-resurrection figure. The letters, just thinking chronologically of a story, you have a story of Jesus, and then the death of Jesus. The letters naturally and organically pick up at that secondary phase, don't they? With Christos, not with a Jesus person moving around, a living being, right? So that also, I think, is a clue that you need some kind of a passion to have taken place. I can also add the Paul of the letters is doing something, theologizing, you might say, about the implications of dying. Dying was suffering, of course, for this Jesus, who becomes the Christos, the suffering one. But in the letter, you see the Apostle Paul saying, I suffer too. I suffer like this Christos. And that too seems secondary to me. So logically, I think you need to have that suffering and death, which shows up in the gospel, before you get the letters which do something with that. Take it another step, you might say. What more can I do with that? What's the implication of this dying on the cross for people?
So to expand on my question about Acts,
Yeah.
That was part of the previous question. What do you make of Acts in relation to Paul's epistles? It is often said that Acts is independent of Paul's epistles. One of the reasons being because it never mentions Paul's letters, or it is because the letters hadn't been written yet when Acts was composed. Did Marcian's edition of Paul's letters post-date Acts?
Yes, I do think that we need we need Acts before you have the letters of Paul. And in the book, I spend a good deal of time talking about the name of Paul. I think you cannot have a letter of Paul, Apostle Paul, I'll use the word Apostle Paul, before you have the character Paul known. And I'll expand on that later in a minute, actually. And this is where I come to the centrality of Acts. Because in Acts, you have the character Saul, who in Acts 13 then takes on the name Paul. And that needs to happen before you have the letters of Paul. That character has to be made known. Paulus, it's really Paulus if you go to the Greek. In that Acts 13 chapter, there is another actual historical person. I don't know that there was a relationship between the Apostle Paul and this other person, historical person, whose name was Sergius Paulus, who was some kind of provincial Roman ruler of some kind. So it's just too coincidental that in a chapter in Acts where it's Paul's first miracle performed for this Roman official whose name happens to be Sergius Paulus, and then at that moment Saulus, or Saul, moves from Saulus to Paulus. And that very much fits one of the themes of Acts, where Acts is a name change expert, a specialist in name changes. A lot of the characters have two names, and it's thematic for the kind of the Jew-Gentile move and the ethnic move, and that fits very well where you have Paul, King Saul, and there's already been plenty of scholarship equating Saul, King Saul, and the Saul of Acts, very much a Jewish figure, to a Roman figure, Paulus. So I think you need Acts before you have that Apostle Paul of the letters. And the other thing that I think is important about Acts, which would precede the letters, is that notion of apostle. How could you have a letter? And as I said earlier, those letters were quickly taken up as scriptural by Irenaeus, Tertullian. They were seen as authoritative by an apostle Paul. How could they have been read as such if someone wouldn't have known who the Paul was? Who was this Paul? And who is an apostle? Why call yourself an apostle? You have to have that concept of an apostle out there. And that concept of apostle is made boldly, I would say, in the book of Acts, where it's Acts of the Apostles. The apostles are actually doing something. It's their book. What do the apostles do? The apostles became important. Poor Paul wasn't an apostle in Acts, but he sure is an apostle with the letters. I think that is partly what accounts for the popularity of the letters. But again, to get back to your question, I don't think you would have had those letters resonate without somebody knowing a Paul. I mean, you couldn't have had the letters of George, for instance. There's no George. that Paul had to be there, and it's Acts, I think, where we get the Paul character. It's also epistolary scholarship that brings me to that conclusion. And I can cite something of Patricia Rosenmeyer, on whose work I depended, her Ancient Epistolary Fictions. It's a 2001 monograph where she talks about ancient fictional letters. And she also, in that book, where she's talking about pseudonymous letter collections, says it is rare that you would have a letter collection of a person that is not already known. And she makes this one very interesting remark in her book. No self-respecting teacher in the ancient world would assign a student to write a letter based on what the baker's assistant in the house next door said when he found mice in the flour bins. Okay, so you need that. You would ask a student to write a letter of somebody who's known. There were letters of Plato, letters of Demosthenes. These are characters that are known somehow. And then you would tell your student, write a letter saying something about them. Okay, so you need the character. So epistolary scholarship gets me there as well.
And just to expand on what you said a moment ago about the comparison between King Saul and Paul the Apostle in Acts, Paul is kind of like reversing the role between David and King Saul in 2 Corinthians as he's fleeing from King Aritus, supposedly, just as David fled from Saul in the Old Testament. I just want to throw that in there.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm. And of course, in Philippians, Paul is called a Benjamite, which King Saul is, according to the Old Testament. What kind of rhetoric is the real author, whoever that was, employing in writing Galatians, and why do you think the letters were written?
Yeah, that was why write a letter? That really piqued my interest, and it still is interesting to me. When you think about the New Testament and you compare it to the Hebrew Bible, there are very few letters of books of the Hebrew Bible that are letters in the Hebrew Bible. We do have a letter of Jeremiah, but there's very few letters. There's embedded letters in the Hebrew Bible, but there's not a whole book there. But by contrast, you've got in the New Testament is primarily letters. So it's a great question, and it's still of interest of mine, and I think more work really needs to be done on this, picking up the notion of a letter. But I will say that letters lend themselves very nicely to teachings. There is something very handy about using a letter, and that I did, research on modern epistolary scholarship. So what you can think about is there's some what I could call givens about a letter. One is they seem casual, friendly, accessible. They also seem trustworthy, and they seem, again with trustworthy, real. So you have this medium that you could say is rhetorically quite powerful. Friendly, they lend themselves again to being very accessible. The other thing about a letter is you get the sense when you read a letter that the two parties know each other. So you're reading a letter secondarily. We're all reading the letters of Paul secondarily. And you see the Apostle Paul, let's say, addressing the Corinthians. Your thought, my thought, others, I would imagine, Paul, the Apostle Paul, knows the Corinthians. So already you can have that notion because of a letter. A letter allows the secondary reader to already see that there is a relationship established between the sender and the person being addressed, the addressee of the letter. So that is also very interesting. And these are all givens about letters. They're trustworthy. They have a reputation for being trustworthy, authentic, real. They come with that. It's in their packaging, you might say. That's the reputation of a letter. The other thing that I found in researching, I did a comparison between Seneca's moral epistles and the Apostle Paul's letter. And we know, which was extremely handy actually, because we know that the moral epistles are all fictive. So there I'm in safe territory with fictive letters, and I have an epistolographer, a letter writer, who is manipulating the letter, and I can look at how he's manipulating the letter in a safe place, because I know they're fictive. I know his addressee, Lucilius, is fictive, so I can look at all of that. And then I can take that and see, are there parallels, or can I make parallels with the Pauline letters? So that's one of the things that I do. And what I discover is, this is something else that, a nice discovery for me, is that these epistolographers were smart about this. Seneca knew he's writing fictive letters, but he had to keep up the fiction of a letter. And you can see how he's keeping up the fiction of a letter. First of all, each letter starts with Seneca to my Lucilius greetings. So each time he's making it a new letter, he's making a new relationship with Lucilius, which is very attractive for secondary readers. And all these fictive letters are aimed at secondary readers. The regular addressor, the dramatic addressor doesn't exist, right? So Seneca's writing to the person over there, the secondary reader, but he wants it to look like a letter. So he keeps talking to Lucilius. So I talk about sender-addressee engagement. Epistolographers have to keep that up so that it keeps looking like a letter. And that's one of the things they do. So Seneca says, oh, I imagined seeing you yesterday, Lucilius. It was wonderful to think about you. And that keeps up this engagement, this letter-like engagement, meaning that people are going to read his letters. What are his letters? His letters are Stoic teachings. Seneca ultimately wants to teach Stoic philosophy, but he does it through this friendly medium of a letter, which is very interesting. The other nice thing about a letter is, again, epistolographers have to keep the letter engagement going, and one of the other moves that they make is to put in what's called occasional discourse or concrete issues. They bring it back down to earth and say, oh, did you send me a letter yesterday? Seems like I heard from you. And that keeps up this fiction of a letter, that you have a real letter. Then that'll go on for one or two sentences and they'll say, you have to keep up your Stoic discipline. You have to really be concentrated on this. But they pepper it with these occasional remarks. And you can see the same things happening in the Pauline discourse. References to letters, that happens quite often. Little drops of mentioning another letter here or there. That can be seen as a discrete episode. Or I think these other things about the man who's sleeping with his stepmother. You get issues that segue into teachings, and that lends itself very beautifully in a letter format. It's interest. It's all about reader interest. It's what you're working at, and a letter allows that.
Who is Clement of Rome? What do you make of First Clement? And did Clement compose the letter? And does it indicate Paul existed and attest his letters in the first century in any way?
Well, that I do bring up First Clement. It's one of the letters I talk about, and Clement becomes important for my thesis. He could be, you might say, a spoiler in my theory that the letters are a collection of closer toward the mid-2nd century. And a spoiler because the letter First Clement does refer to Pauline letters, and that the traditional dating of the letter First Clement has been the end of the 1st century, around 96. So that's where it would be a spoiler, you might say. But in more, which is what I talk about in the book, is more recent scholarship dismisses that 96, the date of First Clement is 96, and much more easily can see it as a mid-2nd century letter. So it does not overturn then a mid-2nd century collection of Pauline letters. The fact that First Clement knows it can still be after the collection of the Pauline letters, once First Clement is moved later. But First Clement, I was looking at it again recently. It's very long. I don't know if you know First Clement. It goes on and on and on.
I'm aware.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me a little bit of First or Second Peter, but greatly stretched out much more. Where I'm going with this, it looks like, really an expanded First Peter. So already, with my leaning toward fictive apostolic letters, I would say that is just another manifestation influenced by the Pauline letters and First Peter, and then taking the letter even to a further manifestation of a very long letter with teachings and encouragements on moral behavior. How it became associated with Clement of Rome, I'm not exactly sure, and called First Clement, because it doesn't really talk about itself as being First Clement. The addressee and addressor it comes from a community of Rome to a community of Corinth, which is interesting. How can you probably wouldn't have a whole community writing the letter. Clearly one person, I guess Clement was thought to be the author behind that community of Rome in the traditional way of looking at it, to be the scribe talking up for that, giving the advice for that community of Rome, Clement of Rome, yeah.
Did Paul exist?
Well, I sort of got to that a little bit. I think Paul exists in Acts. Well, there's really two Pauls, aren't there? And there's been two Pauls since I've been studying this material. And it's even more pronounced in a lot of the scholarship. There's the Paul of Acts and the Apostle Paul of the letters, and there's certainly relationships. And there's always been relationships, but we've thought the reverse, haven't we? That the letters preceded Acts. The letters, several scholars think that the letters inform Acts. And I would have said before I wrote this book that the Paul of the letters existed and wrote those letters, but I don't hold to that anymore. I think the letters were written by another person. So the Paul of Acts, I think, was a fictive Paul and has been a fictive Paul in scholarship for a long time. It was just the Paul of the letters who was writing letters as he's moving around to various communities. I think a stationary writer in a school, a known school, makes more sense of the letters and even the topics of the letters. As I said at the beginning, this question of the history of Paul, or the historical Paul, is a modern question. It wasn't there at the beginning. I think it's a question that emerges around the Enlightenment, and we're still thinking about that historical question. But look at all the importance of Paul without the importance of the historical Paul. I don't see a loss. I wonder, when you ask me this, are people going to think this is a loss for the religion, a loss for faith, or whatever? I don't see it as a loss. I see it as a gain, especially a gain for how we understand early Christianity. If this helps us to get a clearer picture of the emergence of Christianity, I mean, that's what I'm hoping for with this, that we can rethink how did it emerge? How did Christianity emerge? And I think the place of literature is important for this emergence of Christianity. I don't know if I answered your question. I hope I did.
You did.
Thank you.
And I want to remind everybody that the link to Nina Livesey's book is in the description below and the pinned comment below. So go get it. Go get yourself a copy. That being said, thank you for joining me today, Professor Nina Livesey.
Hey, we even get to shake hands in person. It's
Indeed.
great. Thank you so much, Jacob.
Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.